is a certain magical stretch of the Thames in London that was at the centre of an 18th century cultural movement that changed our British landscapes forever. At the heart of it was a fascination with the ancient concept of Arcadia, where man and nature lived in perfect pastoral harmony.
This is where sort of Walpole described that Kent jumped the fence and saw that all nature was a garden.
A radical group of writers and artists completely overturned the idea of what comprised a beautiful landscape and challenged the formality of the day.
It's emphasising the complete power of the monarch.
Their legacy can still be seen around the world. So who were these visionaries at the heart of this transformative movement?
Pope is enormously famous, enormously influential at this period.
And where did their inspiration come from?
This is the classical tradition being fantastically realised by the 18th century imagination.
I'm Yanina Ramirez, and I'm going to explore their world along the Thames, visit their houses, gardens and curious creations, and discover why their ideas are still so relevant today.
I've got all the advantages of the city, but many of the advantages of living where nature is still visible.
As I go in search of Arcadia.
Arcadia, a vision of pastoral bliss where man and nature lived in harmony. It was the ancient Greeks that first came up with the idea of Arcadia, and it's fascinated people ever since.
This Greek mythology and the idea of a pastoral Eden led ancient poets like Virgil to write poems that idealised Arcadia, developing a philosophy that has lasted for centuries.
And in Britain in the 18th century, this seductive philosophy inspired an explosion of interest in Arcadian themes. This was expressed across all the arts, in poetry and writing, in painting, architecture and garden design. And that's what I want to explore in this programme.
In the early 1700s, an extraordinary group of people were drawn here by royalty, nobility, and by the beauty of this stretch of the river. They tried to transform this Thames landscape into an Arcadian idyll. To help me understand what inspired them, I'm starting my journey with an iconic image. This is one of the most important and famous of the Arcadian paintings. It's Et in Arcadia Ego by Nicolas Poussin, painted in 1638. Everything about this painting gives that impression of harmony. There's the frame all the way around the edge of these beautiful trees and mountains and the grass. So the landscape is part of this Arcadian idea, but so are the figures. They are part of the trees, of the mountains that embrace them and surround them. Man and nature harmonised. It's not hard to see why this painting has inspired so many people. This is Garrick's Temple. It marks the start of the Arcadian Thames, a 12-mile stretch of river that flows through a classically inspired landscape. This unique part of the river winds its way past Hampton Court, through Twickenham, Richmond and Kew, and then finally on to Chiswick. I'll be travelling down the river by boat with John Bailey, waterman and historian, who'll be experiencing the essence of the river, while I'm discovering more about the people at the heart of this revolution, where they lived and what they did to transform this landscape.
Hey, you're here.
We're starting our journey together on a traditional Thames wherry.
Right, let me get the rope and pull you up.
Okay.
There we go. Oh, it's
Thank
good
you.
to
It's lovely to
see
see
you.
you.
Oh, right. Have you got your
So,
fishing stuff with you?
I've got my fishing stuff, and I've got a copy of my very favourite book for you. It's Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler. You'll have heard of it, obviously, the most famous fishing book there has ever been.
The Complete Angler was written by Isaac Walton and was published in 1653. It's an English literary classic and is one of the first books to call for responsible management of the natural world. Walton believed that being at one with nature was key to spiritual enlightenment.
John, I want to know, why is it that this book has done so well? Hasn't it been reprinted something like 400 times?
400 times over 400 years. Obviously, there's a lot of good fishing stuff in there.
Right.
And really surprisingly good fishing
It's
stuff.
usable as a fishing
It
manual,
is.
yeah?
It is, even today. I mean, there are some beautiful, beautiful bits in it for the angler. I think it's been so successful, Nina, because over centuries and centuries, people have just been able to dip into it and take from it, in a way, what they want to take from it. It's this beautiful mix of fishing, countryside, fun, friendship, advice. I mean, I'm sure Isaac didn't expect it to be such a massive, massive success.
Isaac Walton was an Anglican and a deeply religious man. His faith was reflected in his enthusiastic praise of the beauty of the countryside and the human place within it. The book takes the form of a dialogue between a fisherman, a hunter and a falconer, mixed with poems, songs and practical advice on fishing.
This is a dialogue between Piscator and Venator, between the fisherman and the hunter. And Isaac is trying, through the words of the Piscator, to create this idyll that the angler experiences and loves. And I think this is what's kept it going, made it so successful throughout the centuries, because, of course, it was one of Wordsworth's favourite books. If you look in there, you'll find my bookmark, and one of my favourite little songs in there. I don't expect you to sing it, but you might like.
I don't know how to sing it, but I can certainly read it. This one, the Milkmaid song.
Yeah, just a start gives you a taste of what Walton's about.
OK. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that valleys, groves, or hills, or fields, or woods and steepy mountains yields. That's gorgeous. Do you know why I like it? I like the fact that it roots it firmly in the British landscape.
At the time of its publication, England was still recovering from the brutality of civil war and was mired in political chaos. The king had been beheaded and the country was ruled as a republic. Yet Walton proposed that time spent in nature, enjoying the simple pleasure of angling in pastoral surroundings, could bring about a sense of well-being. For Walton, fishing was the pastime of sane men in a world of apparent insanity.
Isaac Walton and his friends, they feel physically threatened. They are seeing their religion threatened because, of course, they were Anglican and Cromwell was strict Puritan, as you know. So in some ways, this book was if you like, a release for Walton. I think he probably wrote it at this particular time because there was a deep need in him to portray something that was pastoral, Arcadian. There's so much passion, it's almost a spirituality.
That's what fascinates me about it. I think it's this idea that it's a philosophy in the absence of a good, solid religious foundation, which is what happens in the late 17th century. And so, under the guise of an angling book, you have these deep spiritual insights into the relationship between man and nature, don't you?
Right.
What are you off to do now?
Well,
then?
I'm off to meet my great friend, who's
Yeah.
an expert at fishing and an expert on Isaac Walton.
Oh,
And we're going to have a lovely bucolic afternoon.
Gonna go that way?
Yeah.
Going that way.
In many ways, The Complete Angler presented a model of how to live rather than how to fish.
I'll see you in a bit. Bye.
John is heading to the river to experience Walton's philosophy firsthand with fellow angler Keith Elliott.
Hello, John.
You've even brought me a chair.
Yeah.
What have you caught?
I'm giving you a very good demonstration of why it's called fishing rather than catching at the moment, actually.
What am I going to fish? A float or a feeder?
I wouldn't bother with a float, actually. I think the answer is a feeder. Fish it out and see what comes. Really.
We'll have a
just
natter.
here for a sort
We're
of.
just here for a social.
Excellent.
Right, Maestro, I'm ready to go.
Okay, I would have thought about a third of the way across.
I can't cast that far.
You'll catch nothing there just as much as you will two-thirds. So that means less winding in.
Back in the 17th century, the Thames was a means for transporting people and goods through London, but it was also a refuge from the plague, smoke and pollution of the city.
Sitting here today, Keith, it brings home to you what Walton really was about. Yes, he was a fisherman, but it's that lovely oneness with nature. It's that lovely synchronicity. Oh, I thought you had a fish.
It's the worm.
It's the worm.
Not that big a fish, come on.
It's that oneness, isn't it, with the natural world that I suppose even then in 1653 Walton felt was disappearing or being forgotten.
Well, it's here. Well, let's look at it. When he was talking about in this about when there was Auceps and Venator and Piscator, and he was talking about why he was doing it, and I think it was Auceps was saying, why did they go fishing? Yeah, he said, and I profess myself a falconer, and have heard many grave, serious men pity them. 'Tis such a heavy, contemptible, dull recreation, And he says, gentlemen, 'tis an easy thing to scoff at any art or recreation. A little wit mixed with ill nature, confidence and malice will do it. And then he talks about why he does it, and he said, let me tell you, sir, there be many men that by others taken to be grave and serious men, which we condemn and pity, men that are taken to be grave because nature has made them of a sour complexion, money-getting men that spend all their time first in getting and next in anxious care to keep it, men that condemn to be rich and then always busy and discontented. For these poor rich men, we Angus pity them perfectly. I mean, Walton put it very well, didn't he? It wasn't about catching fish, it was just the relaxation.
Fishing has always been a balm for the soul. I think it's been a means of escape for anglers when they've been traumatised or stressed. And of course, when Walton was writing The Complete Angler in the 1650s, it must have been easily the most terrifying time of his life.
Seven years after the publication of Walton's book, the monarchy was restored to the throne in 1660. In the years that followed, the nation became more politically settled. Yet despite Walton's book becoming fashionable, his idea of living in harmony with nature was still out of step with other tastemakers of the time. The next destination on my Arcadian journey is one of the most famous historic palaces in London. In the late 17th century, joint monarchs William III and Mary II embarked on a massive rebuilding project here at Hampton Court. They commissioned Sir Christopher Wren to rebuild the palace in a grand Baroque style, reminiscent of the great European courts.
This was to be a grand statement for a reformed, powerful monarchy, and it needed a garden to match.
William III ordered the Privy Gardens to be remodelled in a formal French or Dutch style, inspired by the grand gardens of Versailles. The grass was cut into intricate patterns with a background of sand and gravel, and yew trees and hollies were shaped into cones and globes.
This really is nature ordered, controlled, contained, suppressed even. It's emphasising the complete power and authority of the monarch over everything, even the natural world.
Within just a few years of the garden's completion in 1702, formal gardens and the Baroque style began to fall out of fashion.
Did you catch anything?
Absolutely nothing.
This was the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, a movement which placed reason at the centre of ideas about politics, philosophy and science. Society was ready for change.
I did some research before I came out with you on the river, and so there's these two very well-known literary geniuses, Joseph Addison and Alexander Pope, and they write articles in newspapers about 10 years later, 1712, 1713, in which they satirise these sorts of formal gardens. You think of them as being interested in poetic themes and big ideas, but in this case they're actually talking about the taste, the passion for these clipped gardens. The first quote is Joseph Addison in The Spectator in 1712. Our British gardeners, on the contrary, instead of humouring nature, love to deviate from it as much as possible. Our trees rise in cones, globes and pyramids. We see the marks of scissors upon every plant and bush. So Addison's poking fun at it. Pope, in The Guardian in 1713, he takes it on another step. He makes a link back to something else, something that maybe poets and painters and garden designers should be aspiring to, which is the taste of the ancients. He says, there's certainly something in the amiable simplicity of unadorned nature that spreads over the mind a more noble sort of tranquillity and a loftier sensation of pleasure than can be raised from the nicer scenes of art. This was the taste of the ancients in their gardens. How contrary to this simplicity is the modern practice of gardening. We seem to make it our study to recede from nature. So again, he's talking about receding from nature. Addison's talking about deviating from nature. But Pope takes it a step further. He's saying it's actually about more than just gardening. That what we want to be replicating in our outdoor spaces is something that's more like this sort of history painting, these wonderful works like the Poussin et in Arcadia Ego, where it's man and nature in harmony, everything's loose, everything's idyllic. And also going back to the taste of the ancients in their poetry, going back to Virgil, going back to pastoral poems, that looking at those exemplars, we should be making that happen in our gardens as well.
So it's a whole philosophy.
Exactly, it's a whole philosophy, and I think people nowadays tend to separate out these things, art, painting, literature, from gardening. In this time, it was serious stuff. It was about taste, it was about creating vistas in the landscape that were like living paintings. So what do you want your living paintings to look like? Do you want them all clipped and constrained and cut with scissors, or do you want them to go back to this taste of the ancients?
Let nature breathe.
Exactly.
Right, hold on.
Okay, we're nearly there. Right, let's go. Well
Pope
done.
and Addison's comments in the newspapers were dismissive of formal gardens like those at Hampton Court, and suggested that people should create gardens to look natural and classical.
I will see you later.
See you later. So why was Alexander Pope, an 18th century poet, writing so scathingly about formal gardens? And where does he fit into our story?
Pope was part of a new progressive literary set, the Augustans. Known for their satire and wit, they were obsessed by the work of Virgil and Homer. To find out more about Pope, I'm meeting Ross Wilson, an expert in 18th century literature.
Hi, Ross.
Hello.
In a pub in Twickenham that Pope may have visited himself.
Oh, I can't believe we're sat possibly where Alexander Pope would have sat.
Indeed, yeah. He didn't live far away from here.
Where the great minds sat.
No, indeed, yeah. He really was the most successful poet, certainly of the first half of the 18th century.
There's particular poems that he's famous for, isn't he? What are his really big ones?
That's right. It's fair to say that many people today wouldn't necessarily know of Pope's works directly, but it's almost certain that they would have heard some of Pope's lines. So the line "Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind," of course, lent title to a film. A little learning is a dangerous thing, very true. And fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and so on.
He's such a fascinating character to me, though, because to me, he symbolises the triumph of the underdog in many ways.
That's right. He was very ill as a child, and then really throughout his life he contracted a disease called Pott's disease, so tuberculosis of the bone, which left him stunted and hunchbacked, afflicted by crippling shortness of breath and pains throughout his life. And he was also from a Roman Catholic family, which at that period had very significant disadvantages. So, for instance, Roman Catholics were barred from living within 10 miles of the cities of London and
I
Westminster.
find that amazing. So Catholics simply could not live in the centre. They had to move out.
Pope's father moved his family from Hammersmith to Binfield in Berkshire to escape the anti-Catholic prejudice, but it enabled Pope to form an attachment to Windsor Forest, the subject of one of his first poems.
So Binfield is very close to Windsor Forest. He's in fact surrounded by Windsor Forest, which is one of his great early poems of 1713, a very important pastoral poem.
And in terms of the importance of the pastorals,
Yeah.
they were popular, were they, these poems? They got a readership.
That's right. So really it's the pastorals in many ways which he wrote at the age of only 16 that launch Pope's career and that make him celebrated as a poet. And what Pope does in those poems is really make the Thames, make around here a suitable setting for pastoral poetry.
So we could say really that Pope's responsible for the eulogising of the Thames, elevating it to this almost classical status.
Yeah, so again, in his pastorals are all set on the banks of the Thames. And he's insistent not only in comparing the Thames to the eulogised rivers of classical antiquity and of Europe and so on, but actually saying that the Thames is more beautiful.
Alexander Pope's work was now influencing other forward-thinking Augustan writers of the day. Friends like dramatist John Gay, who went on to write The Beggar's Opera, and Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels. They were known as the three Yahoos of Twickenham.
It's wonderful because for someone that seemed to have everything against him,
Yeah.
looks-wise, appearance-wise, but also socially and in terms of him being a Catholic, his celebrity is unparalleled, isn't it?
Yeah, and Pope's influence is enormous as well. So there are a whole host of imitators throughout the 18th century, and he comes very much to dictate the literary taste of the middle years of the 18th century, certainly. So Pope is enormously famous, enormously influential at this period.
Pope's love of the classics inspired him to translate Homer's Iliad, which earned him a huge sum of money. His newfound wealth enabled him to lease a house and a 5-acre plot of land here in Twickenham in 1719. It was to become his retreat, his Tusculum as he called it, and the gardens became famous.
He develops the house into this Palladian villa that fronts the Thames and has a kind of lawn leading onto the Thames.
So what's also important, I think, is Pope doesn't just create this landscape in his imagination or in his poems. He invests in a plot in Twickenham on the Thames, deliberately so, and then cultivates it, creates
That's right.
a poetic scene in this 5 acres.
Yes, and there's a considerable overlap actually between how Pope thinks about poetry and how he thinks about gardening. So the kind of unaffected simplicity, the free natural taste that is embodied in his garden, and all these things are important to Pope, and he's really very fond of what he's managed to achieve there.
Pope's house and gardens in Twickenham were demolished years ago, and now a school stands on the site. But there is one extraordinary feature of Pope's original estate that remains.
This road was here in the 18th century, but Pope had a problem because his house was on one side and his gardens were on the other. But he came up with a novel solution and built an underground walkway beneath the road.
But this wasn't just a functional subway. What started out as a plain brick passageway was transformed by Pope into an imitation of a natural cavern.
This underground passage, known as Pope's Grotto, embodies his love of the classics. It's fashioned in a true Arcadian style. Pope even wrote in one of his letters, were it to have nymphs, it would be complete in everything.
It's estimated that over the course of his lifetime he embedded over 30 tons of minerals, rocks and curiosities in the walls here. The grotto has now fallen into disrepair, and Angela Kidner is part of a group planning to restore it to its former glory.
Hello,
Hi, Angela, how lovely to see you.
And you.
Which way are we going? This way?
This way.
Oh wow, so we're in
the North Chamber.
the North Chamber, because there's a number, aren't there?
There are two chambers. There's a central corridor and there's the entrance chamber, which we've just passed through.
So really, what we can see through there, that existing building and door, that wouldn't have been there.
No, you would have seen a sloping green lawn. There would have been the river glinting, boats passing up and down a very busy river, and the light flooding from Ham Lands on the opposite side. So all of this would have been quite light.
And why did Pope build this?
Well, the first reason was a practical one. He needed to get to his garden on the other side of the highway. The second was that he was fascinated by the classicists and also by the burgeoning fashion for the natural landscape. And so he wanted to create something that was a sparkling but natural cave. He applied stones and bits of glass and crystal to the walls of this place, which were to him a place of contemplation and retreat.
Should we carry on and do some investigating?
Yes, just above here. There is an ammonite.
Oh yes. Wow. There's curiosities around every corner.
So this is the south chamber, and we've got some finds here that were discovered 20 years ago.
Gosh, what a table of amazing treasures.
Yes, there's coral from the South Seas. These were all gifts from people who were friends or friends of friends, very often people who were just pleased to supply Pope with something for his collection. And he rewarded them with pineapples from his garden and bits of his writing.
So a lot of them were gifted.
Yes.
And that does sort of suggest that he was quite a popular chap, that
Very
people were willing to
popular.
give him these things.
Yes, I think people were following the progress of this grotto, and he was terribly fashionable. He was visited by Voltaire and Johnson and all the great names of the age. And I must show you this. He had weeping willows framing his garden. This, after he died and after the willow died, was brought into the grotto as a memory.
So this is all that survives of Pope's garden, isn't it?
It is.
And in terms of the experience then, there were things that he put in place to make it more dramatic for his visitors, didn't he?
Yes, people would arrive here by boat and process up to the house through the garden, which was lined with statues and so on, and then through the grotto to the 5 acres of garden behind.
Pope tried to create classical scenes in his garden, mirroring techniques used in landscape painting. He cheated perspective and created long views and vistas. It was a new approach to garden design, and many people came to see his creation.
And we're talking lots and lots of guests that were coming through
Lots
here.
of guests, yes. He had very famous guests like Johnson, Swift and Gay, and he had parties of visitors who would come and he would show them his gardens and his grotto. Come this way.
Pope discovered a passion for geology as a result of building the grotto. He continued to develop it throughout his life.
He found a rill of the purest water, which flowed through the grotto and diagonally out the other side, which was of great excitement.
That's hugely symbolic in an Arcadian sense, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The source of the water, the source of inspiration.
Imagination.
Am I right in thinking he had a glitter ball in here?
I think it could be called that. It was the orbicular globe that hung where he sat to write. But he's certainly pictured sitting here at his desk under his globe, which was alabaster, with sparkling minerals reflecting the light from the river. He would close the doors at either end, and the interior would sparkle from the light through the holes in the doors.
It does sound to me like an 18th century disco ball. It really does.
And we think this is what it looked like.
Strange coming out of the darkness of Pope's Grotto to this, the Thames. And what really has struck me, thinking about not just his poetry, but what he does with his house in Twickenham, it's as if there is a chain reaction that begins, starting off with his ideas of classical Arcadia and then rippling out through his social network, through his friends, to be embodied either side of this stretch of the river.
By the early 1720s, there was an explosion of interest in classical themes and ideas. Pope's views on the natural world and garden design were already attracting significant attention and patronage. One of Pope's closest and most influential friends lived next door to him in Twickenham, and she was a member of the royal household.
This beautiful Palladian mansion behind me is Marble Hill House. It was the home of King George II's mistress, Henrietta Howard.
Esme Whittaker can tell me how Henrietta and her social set helped Pope's ideas spread beyond his gardens in Twickenham.
Hello, Esme. Lovely to see you.
Welcome to Marble Hill.
And here she is, Henrietta Howard.
Yes. She's a remarkable woman, and she actually overcame great personal adversity to become a very influential person in the Georgian court. She was part of the royal household, so she was a woman of the bedchamber for Princess Caroline. And perhaps more famously, she was also the mistress of the Prince Regent, the future George II. But she was also the friends of poets and of politicians, and she was an architectural patron and a collector of art and porcelain. And she was known for her diplomacy. She was actually nicknamed the Swiss, which I think is an important quality when you're in a court that's full of kind of gossip and scandal. And really, she was at the centre of a circle of poets and writers that really followed her here to Marble Hill. And Pope famously said that there was a greater court here now at Marble Hill than at Kensington. And it was a place where her friends could congregate, and also they really kind of made use of Marble Hill when it was still under construction and before Henrietta had retired from court. So we know that friends such as Jonathan Swift christened himself chief butler and keeper of the ice house, and Pope had a meal here actually to celebrate the birth of the female calf on the farm at Marble Hill. It was sort of any excuse, I think, for a celebration.
A cow has been born, let's have a party.
Exactly. And he writes to Henrietta how they celebrate with flesh and fish and a lettuce from a Greek island called Kos, which was exotic at that time, and that the housekeeper, Mrs. Susan, offered them wine, and it would just be rude to refuse, wouldn't it, really? It was very much at the heart of the Twickenham set. So one of the reasons why she was attracted to Twickenham as an area was the fact that Alexander Pope had already moved here. So that was one of the reasons why she decided to build the villa here. And that close relationship and friendship with Pope. Really, it's reflected in his poetry, but also in the fact that he commissioned this portrait of Henrietta.
I think that what's so interesting as well is the way she's being depicted there. She looks so Arcadian and she's pure, she's virtuous, she's beautiful, and that's how Pope saw her.
Yeah, in this slightly informal dress, showing that it is a portrait for a friend, but then also quite a direct gaze. And I like the way that she's posed in front of this landscape, so we actually think it's more of an infinite vista, so alluding to the pastoral world of the poet.
In the 18th century, views and vistas were becoming significant features in landscape design, drawing the eye to prominent landmarks and creating a sense of unity in the landscape, which went well beyond the boundaries of your own garden. John's next destination is the Great River Avenue at Ham Lands. This avenue, which is part of the Ham House estate, originally stretched from the riverbank opposite Pope's house right up to Richmond Hill. It's now overgrown. Rebecca Law and a team of volunteers are restoring the avenue back to its 18th century state, using traditional methods sympathetic to the environment and in harmony with nature.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, right,
How
John.
are you?
Good.
Well, this looks fun, but it's more than that, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes. We've been doing a lot of restoration of historic vistas, avenues, and the landscape, particularly around sort of the 18th century sort of landscapes, particularly in this area.
Come on, come up.
This is the Great River Avenue, which originally was from the view to Richmond Hill, which is the Royal Star and Garter, all the way down to what was Pope's Villa in Twickenham. What we would like to do is at least restore that view so you can get the feeling and the sense of that avenue back. And this project especially is quite nice because it's restoring a lost avenue as well as doing a lot of diversity and habitat. So it's not just about the people, it's not just about the history, it's also about the wildlife.
That's my boy.
To avoid damaging the environment, the volunteers are not using any machinery. Tom Nixon and his horse Murdoch are clearing the cut timber.
Basically what we're doing here now is the volunteers have already cut all this brash and put it into nice tidy bundles for us. So basically we have the choke chain on the bundle of timber now, and we're going to hook it into Murdoch's spingle tree, and then we're going to take it away. This is Murdoch's job, among many more. Okay, walk on. Jump, jump. Good lad. Come on, son. Come on, come up. It's very important that we think of the horse's welfare as well, that we don't give him too big a load to pull. It's most important that he trusts us, that we're not going to put him into a dangerous area, and we never do that.
And on your side of things, Tom, I mean, obviously this is a lifetime's experience, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm working with horses all my life, John, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I've been farm horses and forestry horses. Come up, come up, come up. Mind your face off them now, John. Come up. That's the fun. Come on, son. Oh, stand there now. That's my boy.
Just watching this scrub being pulled through, Tom, that's good for the land in itself, isn't it?
Of course it is, John. The load we're pulling, the branches and the brash, it's opening back the brambles, it's taking them out of the way, it's pulling them out by the roots, and this is leaving the forest floor open. So come the springtime, the sunlight will get in, it'll bring up our wildflowers, and hopefully a regeneration of our native oak trees. So basically everything we do is good.
Every little part of this process
Absolutely.
is great.
We've been given a blank canvas to work here because this woodland has been ignored for so many years. So it's important that we plan every step and work it in the proper fashion. Come on, son. Good lad. Okay. Come up. Come up. Why just up there now? You don't get steady.
So restoring these avenues is really going back to a 17th, 18th century plan, isn't it? There's nothing random about this.
No, these avenues were laid out to link together the different villas and estates. So Ham House obviously is a very important, was an important estate. You have Marble Hill over on the other side, then you've got Hampton Court Palace further down, and there were several smaller villas privately owned that dotted the riverside. And these avenues were that connection between those estates for people to walk through and enjoy. So it's using the river as that connecting corridor to bounce the different parks and gardens and the elements across.
It is that wonderful feeling of being out in the wild.
It is. I mean, that's what we would say with that. It's that Arcadian history and that Arcadian feel that we really want to show.
Ooh.
Back in Marble Hill, on the other side of the river, I'm discovering more about the 18th century origins of the Arcadian Thames. It wasn't only landscape design that was being revolutionised at this time, it was also architecture that was being influenced by the classics.
Let's just take you into the Great Room and we can have a look at the Panini paintings.
Oh, fantastic. I love Panini. Oh, wow. Well, this is it, isn't it? This is the classical tradition being fantastically realised by the 18th century imagination.
Yes, and these works were painted by Giovanni Paolo Panini in Rome in 1738. These are very much imaginary views. So Rome didn't actually look like this. This was very much a construct on the part of the artist to highlight all those kind of well-known features. And they were very fashionable at the time as a type of souvenir for English gentlemen who were going on the grand tour.
Glorified postcards, really.
Yeah.
But they're summing up what the grand tour is all about, aren't they?
Yes, so the grand tour is basically the name that was given to these travels in Europe. So it often followed a set route, but the ultimate aim really was to go and visit Italy, and in particular to go to Rome. And it was very much seen as a prerequisite of a young gentleman's education. So it was a chance to learn languages, learn about art and architecture, and also it was a great opportunity to shop. So they bought classical statuary and paintings and even fans and perfume. And Lord Burlington, who owns Chiswick House, is known that when he came back from his first grand tour, he actually brought 878 trunks of purchases back with him. So
that's some serious shopping. My goodness.
The Grand Tour was not only an excuse for young gentlemen to shop and visit ancient ruins, it also introduced them to the works of Andrea Palladio, a 16th century Italian architect. Inspired by the buildings of ancient Rome, he developed a theory of ideal proportions in buildings known as Palladianism.
Early designs for Marble Hill were by the architect Colin Campbell, who was one of the key promoters of the Palladian style in Britain. And he published a work called the Truvius Britannicus, which was a survey of the national architecture. But in the introduction of it, he's really promoting Palladio. And actually, the early design for Marble Hill features in the third edition of this book.
And this symmetry of Palladian architecture and its classical origins perfectly matched the emerging taste for the naturalised landscape garden.
Am I right in thinking that it's actually Pope with the royal gardener, Charles Bridgman, who designed Henrietta's garden?
Yes, that's correct. So we know that Pope and Bridgman and Henrietta all met on site here at Marble Hill in 1724 in order to plan the gardens.
Was it designed along similar lines to Pope's garden then?
There certainly were some similar features. For example, we know that she had a grotto, actually not two grottos. It had serpentine paths and also these wonderful terraced lawns running down to the Thames.
Henrietta was not the only friend to be inspired by Pope and the classical landscapes of the past. Lord Burlington was a great patron of the arts. He had the money and influence to experiment with architecture and garden design on a grand scale. Known as the Architect Earl, he's credited with bringing Palladian architecture to Britain.
Burlington took the Palladian revival very seriously, so he actually went on a second grand tour to Italy, specifically to study Palladio's buildings. And he also started to acquire Palladio's drawings. So he amassed this wonderful library of drawings which he could use as a reference tool when he was designing his villa, Chiswick House. And he was able to basically promote the style much more widely by using his influence to secure places through his protégés, so the likes of the designer William Kent, which meant that the style could be disseminated much more widely and become a national style.
Absolutely, and that's why when we still walk down our high streets today, you will see this classically inspired architecture. It's all coming from around here at that moment.
It is, yes.
I've come to Chiswick House to see Lord Burlington's creation for myself, a classical Palladian villa set in one of the last remaining early examples of an English landscape garden.
The gardens here at Chiswick House were designed by Lord Burlington, Charles Bridgman and William Kent. They're believed by many to be a grander version of Alexander Pope's gardens in Twickenham. What a long way garden design had come in just over 20 years, from the formal gardens at Hampton Court to this.
John Watkins is a specialist in the origins of the English landscape movement.
John, we're here at Chiswick, but what is it that's so important about the landscape, the gardens here, in terms of English landscape design?
I think most important is its influence and the fact that it's still here. Lord Burlington, being a member of the House of Lords and having his properties near London, was in a very good position to be able to influence his set and influence people who were interested in architecture and landscape. And he gathered around him artists, playwrights, architects, and most importantly, gardeners.
So Lord Burlington is the patron, but who's actually here on the grounds doing the design of it?
So Bridgman probably was the first person to aid some of the initial designs here, but two other key people were Pope and Kent. What is interesting, Burlington met Kent in Italy, and I think it's that strong influence of Italian gardens of ancient Rome that influenced in particular the early phases and also the latter phases of the gardens here. And Kent was hugely important because he was able to illustrate both what was in his mind but also what was in Pope's minds and also Burlington's.
Burlington inherited the original estate at Chiswick in 1715 and started work on the gardens soon after. However, it wasn't until the late 1720s that Kent, Burlington and others started to soften the design, reducing its formality.
If we look at this plan here, what we can see is the original garden here on the north side of the image, and there you can see very, very formal features. You've got groves, you've got single avenues, you've got the goose foot, and if we look just south of the house, you see a very formal lawn in this plan with a maze here. Towards the end of his life, the hedges and the trees were removed, and this became an informal lawn with a view over the lake. And this is where sort of Walpole described that Kent jumped the fence and saw that all nature was a garden.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. If you think that that simple lawn influenced many of the great gardens, and Capability Brown took that idea and did it on a grand scale right the way around the country, and you go to places like Central Park in New York, those ideas are then taken further. Let's go and see the transition from the formal to the informal. And of course there's a lovely link with these obelisks, because there's two obelisks here, and the great importance of Pope. You've got the obelisk that he built in his garden to commemorate his mother.
Pope was a poet. How is he influencing garden design?
If you think, he was a great poet, an ideas man, and Pope was a romantic, and of course gardens are the ultimate romantic feature. And so, as a very enthusiastic amateur garden designer, he was taking ideas that he had in his mind and trying them out at home. And his influence is massive, because bigger practical people then took his ideas and developed them further. You add in Burlington, you add in Kent, and you've got the ideal recipe. And then the challenge is saying, where does one influence come in and one finish? That is what is so fascinating.
And yet, I suppose, at the heart of all of it is that shared ideal of Arcadia.
Yes, and that's what links it all together.
For centuries, European formality had been imported into English gardens, like those at Hampton Court. But in less than 3 decades, ideas of what comprised a beautiful landscape had changed beyond all recognition.
Landscape historian, what does that entail?
Being a landscape historian in this part of the world is about understanding how the landscape developed historically, understanding how about this glorious landscape got to where it is, but finding ways to take it into the future. Most people think being a historian is about the past, but in a landscape such as this, it's not. It's all about the future.
This is Sion Reach, a stretch of the Thames bordered by 2 of the most significant designed landscapes in Britain, Kew Gardens on one side and Sion Park on the other. The landscape at Sion was designed by William Kent's protégé, Lancelot Brown, better known as Capability Brown. It's the only remaining natural riverbank in Greater London.
We're now coming to Sion House over here.
The meadows here flood twice a day, don't they, Jason?
They do, yeah. That's one of the things that makes it so special. And it depends on the state of the tide, because different tides have different heights, obviously, throughout the month. And that creates a very special landscape in the way that on the very high spring tides, all of the meadow is inundated with water.
So it's forcing its way down these creeks and channels, isn't it?
It is, yeah, covering most of the meadow in there. And what that has given us is a progression of different habitats, moving from the dry land through to the wetter land by the river. And each of those habitats has a different type of species on it. So the species that love the wetter habitat down by the river, and the grassland species that like the drier habitat up towards the house at the top of the meadow.
And what sort of plants would we expect to find there?
Well, along the river edge here, we've got these wonderful native reed. We've got angelica, water dropwort, watermint. And of course, in the summer, it's just a mass of purple from the loosestrife that thrives along the riverbank. But that's where it's so lovely coming along the river on a winter's day like this, because we can actually see through the line of trees and vegetation here, so we can have a look at the meadows beyond.
Right, and what does happen beyond?
Well, beyond the flood meadows is a classic Capability Brown landscape. What Capability Brown did, of course, here was to sweep away the formality of the Baroque garden. It's got all the elements that you would expect over here in Capability Brown landscape. It's got the ha-ha, it's got temples, it's got Arcadian statues. We've got clumps of trees which allow us to see in and connect the 2 sides of the landscape. We've got flooded streams creating lakes, Arcadian temples, you name it. It is a typical Capability Brown landscape.
Stretch of the Thames became the focus of a cultural movement which changed the face of our English countryside. Ideas expressed in art, poetry, architecture and gardening had fused together, and the naturalised English landscape was born. For the first time, a designed landscape was considered as a collected whole, comprising all that the eye can see. Incredibly, some of the more far-reaching views, such as this one to St. Paul's, are still visible today. And at the heart of it all is the Thames, eulogised and elevated by poets and painters as more beautiful than the rivers of antiquity. But there is one final place to visit before John and I finish our journey, and one more view to see. The only view in Britain protected by an Act of Parliament, here on Richmond Hill. We're meeting Sir David Attenborough and Kim Wilkie, patron and founder of the Thames Landscape Strategy, an organisation which aims to restore and protect the Arcadian Thames for future generations.
Well, I don't know what quite patrons are supposed to do, but whatever it is they're supposed to do, I hope I'm doing it. And I mean, as a local, I am very concerned with this wonderful view. And I would, if someone asked you to help preserve such a thing, how could you say no? So I help in whatever way they ask me to do. The strategy itself cares about the natural world. I mean, think of some other parts of the Thames where this place would be covered by skyscrapers. But here, we've got grass. And we look over there, and there's more grass. And it's been like that for a long time. And our intention is that it should stay like that. For a long time.
And it is definitely about that, isn't it? It's about creating a true relationship between man and nature within London.
I think it's the notion that the river is the centre of things and not a divider of things. And that's what has been brought about.
The English landscape movement was a kind of revolution in political and scientific thought, which started with Alexander Pope. And really started up here on this hill, looking out over that river and that bend in the river. So this stretch of the Thames is really at the complete heart of that whole English landscape thought and political science that happened at that time. I mean, it was a completely different way of looking at the world, and the idea of man in the middle of nature rather than separate from it had huge implications.
Is this Arcadia?
Well, for me it is. I've got all the advantages of the city, which London brings to me, but many of the advantages of living where nature is still visible.
Just to have this amount of green space, this natural space in such a huge city is wonderful, and it's what keeps us sane, and that ultimately is the biggest challenge for cities in this coming century. And also, 100 years goes past very fast.
Think about it.